All right. Hello. It's such a pleasure to have all of you join us this evening, whether you're watching this live or on YouTube at a later date. It gives me immense pleasure to introduce you to what is a session that is really, really close to my heart. Now, all of you know that in TOC, we have always brought in conversations around different careers and different domains. We've spoken to a lot of professionals, um, but there is one career which is personally very close to my heart that we've never covered. And so the whole purpose of this conversation is to really shed some light on media and journalism because truth be told, I was trained in journalism. I was trained as a broadcast journalist and I did my master's in broadcast journalism. My name is Bhakti. I'm the co founder of the Outreach Collective. And when I was thinking of putting this session together, the first name that came to my mind was someone who reached out to me when he was applying to the same university that I was at, which is the University of Westminster. And I was doing my broadcast journalism international into brackets. That's the name of the course. And, Nikhil reaches out and he's like, hi, I was a senior, and he said, hey, how's it going? And how is the experience? Blah, blah, blah. And that's how Nikhil and I connected. Cut to what? 20 years down the line, Nikhil is now a very, very senior and accomplished broadcast journalist. And I am, you know what I do. So we both went two very separate career trajectories, but the whole conversation in the next 30, 40 minutes is going to explore the scope of careers and the state of media and journalism, both in India and globally. Just a very, very quick but important introduction for Nikhil Inamdar. He's a multimedia journalist and a presenter, and he has over 15 years of experience spanning TV, print, and online news platforms. He currently works at BBC World's India Business as BBC World's India Business Correspondent and is based out of Mumbai. He's began his career as a field reporter covering the Indian economy with a special focus on sectors like infrastructure and energy. He went on to helm a lot of NDTV profits, news and stock market shows, including the primetime debate, We Mean Business, as a presenter and a producer. He's been a columnist and features writer for a number of reputed local and international outlets, including the Business Standard, Quartz, BuzzFeed, and others, and led editorial coverage of marquee global events such as the World Economic Forum conferences, Cybos, Hitachi Social Innovation Conclave, and many others. He regularly contributes to The Wire, The Caravan, Scroll, and many other such platforms. He also occasionally hosts Boom Live's Break the Fake, which is a bulletin to bust fake news and counter misinformation. Last but not the least, his first book, Rokda, How Banyas Do Business, which was released by Random House Penguin, was released in 2014 and it went on to become a national bestseller. It sold over 10,000 copies. His second book, Seven Sutras of Innovation, which was in collaboration with the Marico Innovation Foundation and Jeco Books, was published in 2020. So, without further ado, Nikhil, welcome. And how does it feel to be talking to me today, interviewing the interviewer?
Thank you so much, Bhakti. It's fantastic to have reconnected with you 20 years later. I can't believe it's been 20 years ago or about 18 years ago that I went to university. I feel very, very old.
Makes the two of us, Nikhil, and I was a senior, so imagine how old I feel, man. But I mean, thank you for joining us today. And I want to start off by asking the most important and basic question, which is what made you get into journalism? Like, why did you choose to study journalism?
I think that's a really interesting question. It's a question that I haven't really reflected on very much. But if I were to sort of, take a pause and think about it, I think there were a couple of things. One was, that was the environment, that was a time in which, broadcast journalism was really a sunrise sector. You had the likes of NDTV, CNN, IBN, Times Now, all of these channels, just coming in, shoving away or pushing out the monopoly that Doordarshan held on India's screens for a very long time. And so, that was really a time when there were massive opportunities for people who wanted to become journalists. You had the likes of, Rajdeep Sardesai and Barkha Dutt, who we all, emulated and sort of were really role models doing some incredible work on the field. I think, that was one reason that sort of pushed me into this domain. The other one, frankly, was because I was clueless. I was doing my bachelor's degree in English literature, and I didn't really have a specific interest. And if I were to sort of really sort of think in my head why I chose journalism, it's possibly because this is an interdisciplinary field where you need to sort of be capable linguistically. You need to sort of have an interest in economics and politics, in sociology, and various different different subjects that sort of encompass or make up life. And I think because I didn't have this very blinkered or very singular sort of focus, maybe that subconsciously played a part in me choosing to become a journalist.
I resonate so much with that because if someone were to ask me why did I study journalism, other than being terribly under the influence of Barkha Dutt, and I was just so taken by her. I was inspired, but I agree that basically I had a large variety of interests and language and self-expression, and I think also somewhere a slight need for social impact or an idea of justice or social causes was kind of there, and but I didn't know what to do with it. And so you made a very interesting point that how journalism is actually a very interdisciplinary career, and back then we did not have what we call liberal arts now, liberal arts education. But if we did back then we'd probably end up doing that and then going into journalism or something else. um, so you've started with, most students I know are smitten with the thought of broadcast journalism, right? Like when I remember, I always wanted to be on TV. Like for me, that was the reason I wanted to do journalism. Um, what is your view on the different platforms and how redundant or not some of them have become? I mean, print, they say, is pretty much dead, but when there was a time when digital was, where it was at, and then of course, then there is radio and there's TV. But what's your view on the different platforms and where is their place now in the world today?
Right. So, I mean, you asked me why I decided to join. I think, my career in many ways, even sort of the people who've, possibly come a few years after me, it's come a full circle from our television, considered from the sunrise sector to the sun really setting on television, so to speak. Because this is a medium that's really been dramatically disrupted by things such as social media, by digital platforms like YouTube, by OTT platforms. So analog cable TV watching has been gradually on the decline. You no longer have people, doing appointment viewing. I mean, I remember I used to watch the news at 9 o'clock by appointment, or some of the weekend programming by appointment. People are not doing that any longer because you get real-time news on Twitter. You get real-time news delivered to you through notifications, through newsletters, through all sorts of different platforms. And so television is certainly a sector that's been disrupted by the rise of digital journalism. At the same time, print, uh, it, equally true. How many of us actually get a newspaper at home? We don't, right? So it's the websites that we turn to when we want to read something. So I think the traditional mediums of disseminating information have dramatically changed in the last 15, 20 years. It's a sea change from where when I started out.
And you have played roles across print and digital, and now you're on TV, and you started with NDTV, now you're with BBC, and like we discussed before the session began, that we're going to ask you like some harsh truths, and we want some very honest answers. Okay, so um, the transition first of all from an NDTV to a BBC, and what was that experience like, and how is it different, and how do you see uh, the impact on you as a journalist and your experience of being a journalist in an international media house versus an Indian media house?
Right. So, it was quite a few years after I left NETV that I actually joined the BBC. And the BBC was actually the reason why I came back to television. I thought that was history. I'd moved on to doing other things because the Indian media landscape, quite frankly, it deteriorated very sharply. There was a great amount of polarization, a lot of shouting and screaming, putting people in six windows and then, making them essentially brawl against one another. I didn't want to get into that kind of space. Of course, there were issues with, news gathering budgets being completely collapsed, ownership structures being very problematic, the fact that, it is increasingly hard for news as a model to be financially sustainable. And so I'd gone on to doing other things, such as writing books, for instance, and moderating events and so on and so forth. But I mean, the BBC, I think, without bias, not because I'm part of the BBC. I mean, it still remains the gold standard of, journalism. It does journalism the way it ought to be done, with fairness, with accuracy, with a sense of public service, which is what made me come back to television. And in terms of the difference from sort of transitioning from a national channel to an international, I think it's a huge learning curve for me because when you're in a national media landscape, you're essentially serving the Indian audience. You assume a lot of knowledge on their part, so you don't need to do a lot of the context setting. Whereas with the BBC, you're essentially reaching out to people, from Lagos to London to Los Angeles, and not many of them will have knowledge about India, even basic knowledge about India, because you're talking to
Yeah.
different you're talking to a grandmother sitting somewhere in Devon, or you're talking to a student sitting somewhere in Johannesburg, and they will have a very cursory knowledge about India. So I think the first learning was to really, really make sure that you don't assume knowledge on the part of your viewer or your reader. And so context setting in an international format becomes increasingly important, and it's something that has taken me a few years to hone.
It's very interesting that you mentioned that context setting, whether it's, for, when you're working for an Indian media house versus an international media house, and that's a skill, right? And so I'd like to segue into the fact that there is, I mentioned again before the session started, I was telling you that when I'm in classrooms and I'm talking to students and I ask a class full of students, what do you want to do? What do you want to be? And there are very few that actually talk about media or journalism, right? It's not the most popular profession right now with students. And um, I know you mentioned, I'm not surprised, but I feel like they're missing something. It's an incredibly exciting space to be, easy for an outsider to say. So from your perspective, what should a student who so what kind of a person do you think would be a good fit in the space of journalism and media, and what are the kind of skill sets? When I say what kind of person, I'm saying what are the kind of skill sets that you think are most important, and that you think that if you have these skills, this is potentially a viable career for you.
So, before I answer that question, Bhakti, I will just say that I'm absolutely not surprised that, the media and journalism are not first choices for students. And it's, for the right reasons. I think, it's not surprising at all because, as I pointed out, there's been a massive deterioration in the landscape. You no longer sort of see the kind of hard-hitting, credible journalism that you once saw coming out of India, at least from the traditional, big media landscape on television. Of course, there is a lot of that happening now on the digital platforms. Perhaps a lot of students are not aware because those are websites, those are portals that are much smaller. Having said that, they are growing their reach. But in terms of the skills that you need to have, or in terms of what you need to do to become a journalist, I think it's really simple. You need to have an interest in current affairs. You need to like to read, and you need to like to be up to speed with what's happening in the world. And then, as you said, you need to somewhere down the line have the sort of inclination to make some positive impact. You need to have a sense of public service. Uh, if money is really what you're after, I don't think this is a field that gives you a lot of money. It's not as glamorous as it might seem from the outside. Essentially, it's for people who are dogged, who can sort of let go of work-life balance, at least in the initial part of their careers, and people who essentially are doing their job not as a means to an end, which is to make a living, but because they are also passionate about it. I think it's really, really important to be very passionate about your profession, if you want to be in journalism, because this is not an easy field to be in.
It certainly isn't, and it looks glamorous from the outside, when you see news anchors. And I think one very common misconception that a lot of people have is that a news anchor is necessarily a journalist. And I think it would be great for you to kind of give us a little bit of insight into that, because when we see journalists on the screen, in the studios, or they're reporting live, like, it's definitely not as glamorous as it seems. So what are some of the harsh realities of being a journalist, whether it's in the studio or outside? And I'm not just talking about the hardships of travel, but give us the dirt, Nikhil, give us the dirt.
No, I think there is this unnecessary sort of demeaning of the news reader, which I don't agree with. I mean, there was a time when you had people just reading the news, and feeding off a script that was given to them. But if you're in an organization such as the BBC, for instance, the role of the presenter is equally demanding. There's constant breaking news from different parts of the world, and you have to be alert, you have to be on your toes, you have to have the presence of mind to react to world affairs without necessarily having all the information. I mean, there's going to be a blast somewhere, and you will only have two lines about it, and you might perhaps have to ad lib on something like that for several minutes, or uh, several minutes before you can get a reporter on air, before you can get more information fed to you. So it's an incredibly hard job. Uh, of course, if there's no breaking news, it's an easy bulletin you're reading off a teleprompter. Maybe there's sort of you can look glamorous, and there's not much beyond that. News reporting is another ball game. I mean, you need to have other kinds of skill sets. It's not just about traveling. It's about having a wide network. It's about knowing who to talk to. It's about talking to a wide variety of sources to stand up and verify your story. It's about making sure that when you actually package your story and put it out there, it's balanced, that it represents different points of view. And essentially, what you're saying is in no manner sort of concealing information, or in no manner unfair to one party or the other. And I think putting all of that together is very, very difficult.
Yeah, I mean, I think the point that you made about the newsreader is it's such a legit thing to say, because we often see that they are in studios and we are like, oh, okay, they have their makeup on, they're reading off teleprompters. But the fact is that you're right. I mean, they have to have a lot of presence of mind, and they have to be extremely calm, and so there are a lot of other skills that are at play there.
You know,
Perhaps.
for
uh,
anybody who's interested in being a newsreader, I would ask them to do this exercise. I
hmm,
would give you two lines, okay,
hmm.
of information, and then you have your common sense, and then you try and play with those two lines for 10 minutes and see how far you go, and see how many ums and oohs and ahs and stuttering you do. It's really difficult. It's really difficult. And sometimes, you have to go on for hours and hours.
Yeah. Wow. So a lot of presence of mind, clearly,
Yeah.
some amount of storytelling without fibbing too much,
And
engaging the audience.
knowledge.
Knowledge.
You have to
Yes.
have a sort of surface level knowledge of a variety of subjects to be able to pull all of it together without sounding like an idiot, to put it bluntly.
Absolutely. And then sometimes, of course, we've all seen those, legendary debates where, I mean, I'm not talking about the nation wants to know, but, we've all also seen other TV debates where the anchor is just cornered or just at a loss because participants are so irate, the panelists are so irate, and it's so hard to manage them or their egos and where they come from. So Nikhil, I'd love to and I'm sure everyone here would love to know, what is probably one of the toughest stories that you had to break, or some of the most complicated situations that you've been in as a journalist, and how did you get through it, and if you can share what that was.
Well, I mean, there have been many, but the one that instantly comes to my mind is essentially covering COVID from home for 2 years. How do you do it for TV, right? So what did I, in a typical scenario, what do you do when you have a story? You and your camera person hop on a plane, go to a location, film, get sound bites, get visuals, do all of that. You couldn't do any of that in COVID, at least for the first few months.
Hmm.
What do? You have to depend on user generated content. Depending on user generated content means you have to verify it for authenticity. You had to get people to do self filming, some which was atrocious most of the times. You would do a lot. You to get that done again and again. I didn't go out because I cover business, but many of my colleagues had to go out and actually report when it was a risk to their lives. So I think
Yeah.
COVID really a test for most journalists. The fact that despite all of the adversities and despite all of the headwinds and despite all of the challenges, you didn't have a single day when your television screens were shut off. You had your kirana stores shut down, and you had pretty much the entire country coming to the standstill, but television was going on.
um you know uh, Nikhil, in terms of, when you think of journalism, whether it's print or largely broadcast, there are very few, I think, if you ask someone what goes into the making of that, I think they'll probably be able to name two or three. Like they'll say, okay, you need a cameraman, you need a reporter, and that's maybe an editor, if that. Could you shed some light on the sheer number of people and the types of work that they do to that goes into like making of a single like package news story?
Yeah, so as they say, it takes a village.
Yeah.
And increasingly, there is, there's no money to distribute among, all of the people. So the team sizes are shrinking. But typically when you're doing the news package, you would have an editor, you would have a camera person, you would have somebody produce for you, you will have the correspondent, you will have a sort of executive editor, a commissioning editor who actually gives you a green light for the story. And then, of course, there are entirely other teams who put the programs together, who slot your stories, the desk, which will sub and which will sort of tweak and, fine tune your story. So it is a whole number of people, that sort of, those roles, possibly change a little bit when you go to a newspaper and change again when you go to yet another medium. But increasingly, what is happening is that the sizes of newsrooms are shrinking. Uh,
Mm.
and this is like an existential challenge that's been posed to traditional media also by the rise of social media. Where journalism, for the better or for the worse, has been democratized, and you now have one man armies raking up millions of views. That even primetime shows cannot match.
Yeah. And thank you for that, because that segues into the next one, which is, you know, with the advent of social media, where does that leave traditional journalism? Because this is obviously the age of citizen journalism. I mean, I don't even know what that is anymore, because at the end of the day, you don't know what is real from fake. Because we are also in a time when perspectives take over facts, right? And opinions override reality. So, and in a time when there is such little faith in the current media houses, and I'm just saying this, it's a fact that there's so much polarization. Every media house is clearly in the viewer's mind associated with a certain political ideology, and therefore whoever is watching it is going to watch what they orient to, right? So with all this, you know, change and chaos, where does that leave the future of journalism? And so if as a student I'm thinking of like a career in this, and you know, remember, kids in grade 12 right now will probably hit the workforce in another 4 or 5 years. You know, if we're talking about something like a media or journalism career, where does that leave them with what they can expect?
So, you're absolutely right. I mean, this is a very, very challenging environment for the traditional media. As you pointed out, trust in the media is at an all-time low. There's a huge amount of polarization. There's a lot of bias in the media that's crept in on account of a number of issues, from things such as, who owns the media, for instance, so how much government control there is on media. So I mean, I think there is a sort of, forefrontal assault on the way things were, the way things are, and things are gradually changing. And what we have seen here now is this massive emergence of social media. But that's a double-edged sword, because it is completely unregulated. There are no editorial filters. It doesn't adhere to the traditional sort of professional norms, ethics, and fairness that at least to some degree, many reputed media organizations still follow. Uh, and uh, and so you have a situation where people are essentially rejecting many traditional media outlets. I wouldn't say all, because there are still a huge number of them, like the BBC, that are growing their numbers. But many traditional media outlets, and you have a situation where people are turning to social media, where there's a whole number of people who are purveyors of disinformation and fake news. Uh, but at the same time, it's become a force to reckon with. And just to give you, an example of the recent elections that happened in the U.S., where with Donald Trump winning again, you saw that. I mean, I was reading the statistics somewhere about how the numerous social media appearances, so the podcasts that he featured in, the Joe Rogan podcast, for instance, actually reached 33 million viewers, which was equivalent to the multiple primetime cable news appearances combined.
Wow.
So that tells you how potent social media has become for politicians. It's allowed them to completely bypass the traditional media and have a one-on-one conversation with the electorate or with the citizens. But, you know, there are not there are no arbiters of truth. There's nobody out there putting an editorial filter or telling you how you can sort of sift propaganda from truth. You have the likes of Elon Musk, who actually tweeted out after Donald Trump's victory, saying, "You are now the media." Essentially,
Mm.
the users of Twitter or X, which is now what the platform is called. So it's incredibly hard. I mean, it's a double-edged sword. It gives voices to many people, but there is no way to regulate those voices.
Yeah, because all those voices are just like one big like blob, right? There's just no discerning, and you know that also makes me question whether our current journalism education or education in media, right? Is that really keeping up with how quickly things are evolving? Because if you look at an ACJ, the usual suspects, right? MICA, ACJ, IIMC, Jamia Millia, I mean, the ones in India at least, and even globally, for example, Westminster, wherever, right? Do you, I mean, how, you obviously dealt with a lot of fresher journalists. You work with a lot of new folks, I'm guessing, or you may have interacted with them at some point in the last few years. You haven't. Okay. But do you have a comment on like the state of journalism education
You know,
at all?
honestly, I don't know how the education landscape has evolved, Bhakti. But what I would say is that if, with hindsight, and if I were to ask, if I were asked to go back and somebody asked me, would you do a journalism degree? I would not do one.
Hmm.
Because I really do think that I would rather do a degree that added to my domain knowledge, because the technical skills that are required for journalism or for TV broadcasting can be picked up on the job. Uh,
Hmm.
the skills that one requires to write a script, for instance, or to film a video,
Yeah.
all of that stuff you would learn in 2 years. You would learn in 2 months,
Yeah.
from the time that you start out. I would, what I would say is that anybody wanting to be a journalist, really read, read a lot. Make sure that you strengthen your domain knowledge in whatever field you're interested in. If you want to be, if you want to be a defense journalist, I think it might serve you better to work in a defense think tank for a few years and then join the news media. I think I don't think there's an aversion in journalism to hiring domain experts either. I mean, I know of people who've left investment banking and come into journalism, and they're much better financial journalists than financial journalists themselves, because they can do a much better reading of balance sheets and whatnot. So, uh, I mean, this might be a completely subjective opinion, but I do think that if you want to be a journalist, get that MA degree or whatever degree it is that you're getting in a field that you want to specialize your journalism in.
That's a very interesting point, Nikhil, because I think, a lot of journalism is always has, in my mind at least, been traditionally about if you want to be a journalist, a great way of getting there is get a degree in journalism. But what I hear you say is you can be a practitioner or a specialist in a domain, and you'd probably end up making a better journalist, which is the case for, say,
I mean,
teaching.
imagine you're a master's degree from in politics and economics from Oxford. You'd be a far better journalist than somebody with a journalist degree from. I don't want to generalize, but I'd say
Yeah.
you were, because what you're doing there is at a younger age, you're actually seeping deeper, sort of deep diving into a subject rather than into technical skills, which is what journalistic degrees tend to do a lot more.
True.
And you can get a journalistic degree if you want to get into sort of media research or media management, or that sort of stuff. But broadcasting skills or radio skills, or how to design a homepage, that sort of stuff can be learned on the job.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying, because I remember when we, the degree that we did not have a focus on, say, for example, even our projects were like, okay, do a project on anything that you want. Write your 5,000 word essay on investigative piece on anything that you want. And so while we learned a lot of the technical skills like Final Cut Pro and the editing bit and all of that, but we never really ended up, there was no super specialization that came into play, which is probably because I know that I have friends who've done masters in economics and politics. I'm not sure if they'd make great journalists, but I also, because that's a different skill set too,
No, no, I'm
right?
saying, I'm saying
So
if
like,
you, I'm saying if you want to become a journalist, and let's say you want
yeah,
to become a political journalist, I think it
mm,
will be more valuable for you to have learned political theory or political systems or comparative politics or whatever it is. I don't know,
yeah.
exactly what, than to have learned the technical skills. I mean, in a master's journalism degree where one day you're asked to become the anchor, and the next day you're asked to become the camera person, and then you all of you come together and you put that documentary together. I mean, it's fine, but it's very amateur. It's
Yeah.
something that you will get a hang of, and uh, well, you may not master it immediately, but it's something that you will learn to do very, very quickly when you join a news channel.
Absolutely. I still remember some of I still have the videos of the very, very perfectly terrible documentaries that I made as a student. And I look at it and I'm like, ha ha ha, this is just hilarious. But
Mine are
you
so
know,
bad, I wouldn't share them with anyone.
I'll send you mine. I'll send you mine, Nikhil. Yeah, I'll send you mine. We should swap those stories, by the way.
You send me
But
yours, I'm not sending you mine.
but I'm sending you mine. I want you to see mine because now I'm not in it. So who's to judge? Like I didn't take it anyway. But Vidu, coming back to the point that you made about why is journalism not as popular a career in the generation today? And you said a very important thing, which is about the fact that even the salaries, the starting salaries, or the money is not great. Okay. Honest to God, that's one of the big reasons I didn't even start my second job in journalism. I
Yeah.
did something in London and I came back to India and I got miserable starting salaries in Bombay. And I said, you know what, I'm not doing this. And I veered off into another direction very happily. I mean, would I have liked to get a job in journalism? For sure. And do you like, what's your advice to students in terms of what to expect? Because one is, of course, about hands-on experience while they're schooling. And I'm not sure if you're aware, but there's this huge wave of experiential learning that's happening in the world, and especially in schools. So a lot of high school students, grade 11, grade 12, grade 10, they're saying, how do we get real experience in things that we like? um so there's a huge wave of that. So what would your advice be? Part A of the question is, what would your advice be to students who want to get hands-on experience as high school kids? And B, what is your advice to them on what to expect financially from this career?
So, Bhakti, what I would say is that the best way into this field, rather than a degree, I would say, is to actually get an internship, because that's when you will also even sort of get a sense of whether you like it or not. I think it's one thing to assume that one likes something, and quite another to actually experience whether you like it or not. So that's the first thing. As far as how much you should expect, look, the starting salaries are bad. When I started out, I think the starting salaries were some 20,000 rupees. Uh, from what I hear, they haven't significantly improved from that, and inflation is you know grown by leaps and bounds in the last 20 years. So actually, inflation adjusted, maybe the salaries have actually reduced in journalism. Uh, but having said that, there are very good outlets that pay very good money, but these are not salaries that you can compare to let's say the IT field or banking or those sorts of sectors. I think you need to right size your expectations. I think most people come into journalism because they're very passionate about doing this as a job, and not necessarily because they will get the best salary. I think if you want the best salary, go and do an investment banking job. Uh, if you want a great salary, you know, still don't come to journalism. You can, if you want a decent enough salary on which you can
Don't
survive,
come to journalism.
maybe come to journalism. But yeah, this is not a highly remunerative field. Although I would say that as you move up the ranks, and journal anyway, a lot of people fall off, and a lot of people, as a result of the fact that it's not remunerative, or there are job losses and job cuts that happen every year, move into related domains such as corporate
Hmm.
communications, for instance, where
Yeah.
salaries are far more remunerative. So, but if I were a 20-year-old and if somebody asked me, well, to do journalism, I would say maybe, I mean, I would advise my 20-year-old self to do PR, perhaps, even though I absolutely dis.
Hmm.
So, I mean, I'm not saying PR salaries are great, but essentially a lot of journalism has now become PR. Um, so there's very little journalism, at least in India, that is actually happening. Very little
Yeah.
objective, unbiased, critical journalism.
Thank you for that very, very harsh reality check, because my rose tinted glasses about journalism are from 20 years ago. So this was really helpful. And now if you were to take a minute to be slightly positive and say, Nikhil, what do you like about your job? Why do you do what you do?
I mean, I love everything about my job. I love traveling to do the stories. I love putting a package together. It's almost like doing these mini films.
Yeah.
I think the best part of doing my job is actually the scripting and the writing to visuals, and then seeing all of it come together. I love deep diving into a subject and writing a 1,500 word piece about it. The fact that no one day is similar. We're not just going into office and logging onto our machines. One day I could be in Bombay, the next day I could be in Dhaka, yet another day I could be somewhere else in the rural parts of this country. And it's a really enriching life because you are not in an echo chamber. You're meeting people,
Mm.
a varied mix of experiences. And I think journalism allows you to sort of really see how complex most things are, and the truth about most things lies somewhere in the middle of narratives. Of course, journalists create narratives, but the truth always lies somewhere in the middle, and I think it's fascinating to actually be part of decoding that complexity, and as they say, writing the first draft of history.
Wow. Okay. I literally feel like I'm on a talk show right now.
Yeah.
But with that, see, you're interviewing a journalist when you get answers like this, decoding a part of history. It's such that's stellar stuff, man, Nikhil. So I want to now go on to the audience because people have a few questions. And Anjali, I see your question that you've DM'd me, but why don't you take the liberty of unmuting yourself and asking the question yourself? Go ahead.
Hi, Nikhil. I just wanted to know, with the rising AI, Chat GPT, how do you see, the implications of it on the journalism as a profession?
I don't think I'm going to hazard this question at all. I mean, I think it's certainly something that poses a big threat to journalists, because I know, for instance, that many financial journalists now who used to, let's say, look at look at company reports and report on company earnings for platforms such as Bloomberg. Their job is now being done by AI, which will compare what's happening this quarter versus what's happened last quarter, and so on and so forth. So there are many aspects of this job which will be done by AI. I think Chat GPT and tools like Perplexity and so on are being used to augment, the quality of reportage as well, the quality uh, of what you have to say. Some of the sort of basic stuff can be done by AI, and then you actually do the nuts and bolts stuff which AI cannot do. So it can be it is being used as an augmentation tool as well, although I haven't done it. But you know I don't know how far this goes. I don't know what happens when AI develops an emotional intelligence and can write beautiful paragraph that can be that'll read far better than what I can come up with, and then my job perhaps is going to be on the line. But it's certainly something that is I think that's affecting journalism just like it's affecting most other industries.
So I think it's already doing that, Nikhil, because all of our students, so you know that the students have to write their personal essay,
Yeah.
personal statement when they are applying to colleges. So while writing a story, they are using AI, Chat GPT, to answer that question. So I think I don't know how, but moving ahead with AI tools is the only way. I think it is, but I'm really eager to understand, and maybe with time we will know how what kind of tools does can journalism use to make it much more authentic and much better. I think that is what I'm
Yeah, so
looking
I mean,
forward to.
AI will help you perhaps write a better copy, but can AI do a forensic investigation into a company, or can it go and do an interview with a global leader and hold them accountable and embarrass them on TV for, what, they've been doing somewhere. I don't think we've reached that stage yet. So
Yeah, but
uh,
only time will tell. I think it's not too
having said
far,
that,
I guess,
there
with
are,
the robots,
yeah,
the
there
super
are
amazing robots
AI
that are developed.
there are AI news presenters and there are AI anchors. So I think what AI sort of does is what you feed to it, right? I think
Yeah.
there are a lot of things. There are a lot of, I guess, skills where AI cannot be a substitute. And I think the journalists the good journalists will have to sort of rely on those possibly. I don't know if
I
I'm going
think
to
it
very long, but
Yes, the human touch.
I know, I think it's a classic case of, oh, AI will replace teachers and, robots will replace teachers and
It's
technology
not
will.
going to happen.
It's not going to happen.
It's
I
not
mean,
going to happen.
as far as there are old school people like me in this
Yes,
world, it's
me
not going
too.
to happen. We have another very interesting question from Harish. Harish, would you
Thank
like
you.
to unmute yourself? Or thanks, Anjali. Thanks for that. Harish, go ahead, Baba. Go ahead.
Hi, Nikhil.
hi.
Um, I continuously struggle between the notion of censorship and freedom of expression. So, curious to know your opinion about censorship by mainstream media. Is it ever justified? And if so, under what circumstances should it be applied to protect public interests?
I mean, I don't think censorship anywhere is justified, right? I mean, as I think, I don't know who it was that said, I think it was Oscar Wilde, maybe it's wrongly attributed to him, who said that journalism is, printing uh, things that the powers don't want to hear. Everything else is public relations. So I think that is the crux of the journalist's job. Of course, many journalists have forgotten that, or many journalists are being censored either by the government's, the day, or by people who own them, because ultimately, these owners are also beholden to the government in some way or the other. I'm not going to take names, but in the Indian media landscape is essentially run by big conglomerates who cannot afford to say too many bad things about the government, because the government can easily turn around and say, hey, I will not give you a license for your coal mine, or I will make sure that your steel plant shuts down. And so, media ownership has also led to censorship. I think there's also a lot of self-censorship that's come in because increasingly we've seen democratic backsliding. We've seen journalists being jailed for, doing their work. We've seen, journalists being intimidated, threatened, sometimes even killed. And so it's a very difficult environment to operate in. And globally, I think, with the rise of sort of authoritarian politics, it's becoming increasingly more difficult.
Thank you.
Thanks, Nikhil. I have a question. So we're obviously in the space of education. All of us are in the space of education, and there's a lot of conversation. One of the hottest topics right now is the impact of Trump being reelected into the U.S. policies towards international students. And we all know that international students are, they have a direct impact on global economies, right? So why do we not see more stories in the media, especially in business media, about education as a business beyond Byju's, right? Like, why are we not seeing education more at the forefront than just the bad news of Byju's? Like, why are we not hearing more?
So, I think the media is guilty of overcovering Byju's because as the company itself, it was less of an education company and more of a money-making business. And I think media generally loves money-making businesses. So Byju's was covered. I'm guilty of, well, not guilty because I did an investigative story on them. That was also, I can proudly say, referenced in the parliament. But I think education as a beat, just like many other sort of so-called peripheral beats, have been defunded to a large extent. There was a time when you had, for instance, a music criticism column in the Times of India. Do you see that?
Mm.
You don't. There was a time when over the weekends, you had feature shows on anything from Bollywood to education. I remember when I joined UTV back in 2008, we had a show called Cracking Careers. It was a show called Cracking Careers. So when I joined NDTV, there was a show called Just Books, which spoke about books. But I think increasingly, as the funding environment has gotten tougher, a lot of what is seen as peripheral, so things such as books, education, music, films, etc., has started getting less and less of money, which is not a bad thing, which is not a good thing at all, because I think these are subjects that need to be at the front and center of public policy discussion as well, and it should happen more.
I see a very interesting question from Ramya. Ramya, would you like to unmute yourself and ask that, Baba?
Sure. Thanks. And I joined this a little late, so apologies if some of this has been covered. But two things. One is what you had mentioned in response to Harish's. It is true, right? I mean, I think at least here in India, there is generally a sort of curbing of the freedom of the press. You hardly see voices of dissent. And now with Trump 2.0, I don't know, freedom of the press still seems to be alive in places like the US, but generally it's a more polarized world. There's more inward looking governments, it just seems like dissent in general is being dealt with in somewhat of an authoritarian way in many of these countries. And so what should we be talking to students when they say we want to look into the few that want to maybe pursue careers in journalism? And secondly, this is something, as a mother of 3 children and working with high school kids, I feel like media literacy is something that most of our curricula do a pretty, they don't even pay attention to it really. So all that stuff you had mentioned about echo chambers and stuff, what can we be doing more in terms of building that awareness and general media savviness among students?
I think this is a really difficult question to answer, Ramya, but I would just say most people don't sort of avowedly have this vested interest in keeping democracy alive. I think it's still a very theoretical subject for most people. So I think, for anybody, you ask me what you should tell kids about why this is important, from their career standpoint. I think it's more important to tell them why journalism or media as the fourth pillar of democracy is very important as an institution that needs to be preserved. I think, this, unless you have this sort of understanding that this is as important as the legislative, executive, judicial arm of the government to preserve democracy, I don't think people are going to take the media very seriously, and I think the media is a lot to blame as well, because they've willingly sort of bowed down to the powers, not just here, but also, as I pointed out in my previous answers, there's the systemic changes that have taken place or in terms of corporate ownership, or in terms of in terms of authoritarian governments, taking center stage, that has affected the media. But I think it's important that one of the things that we see even among families is adults talking in echo chambers, adults beginning in a country like India, for instance, to hero worship certain politicians. How do you sort of instill that sense of skepticism among children if there are parents at home who are hero worshipping a certain political ideology or a certain political stripe?
I mean, Nikhil, I think one big challenge is also the lack of access to media personalities uh, at the grassroots, which when I say grassroots, I mean schools and colleges. Colleges still have more access, especially if they are journalism colleges. But in schools, I have rarely heard of journalists coming into schools and talking to students, right? So I think a big way to do this is also just kind of bring more media folks and journalists to talk directly to students and parents as well. Sometimes that would be great.
And also, Bhakti, I think one is access to media personalities. The other is actually holding discussions about current affairs with students, right? I mean, you're teaching kids about what happened in history. Why can't you teach them about what's happening today, whether it's, in Ukraine, or whether it's in Palestine, or whether it's, Trump being elected, the ramifications of that, the politics of that, the various shades of opinion on that. And it's only when you expose kids to a dialogue on these matters as their lived reality, rather than, from a perspective of history, that there's going to be an interest that will be built up in the media at a younger age than it is currently being, right?
Absolutely. Ramya, go ahead.
Sorry, so I wanted to share one thing and I had a request as well. So, for those, just the counselors who are here, so one of the things, the Economist Foundation has this brilliant set of free resources that we've used in our school to work, especially with kids between the age of, I'd say 11 and 14 or 15, where every week it's a different news item, and it really makes you think from different perspectives. It's a discussion based thing, so they give you all the resources and you can use it. So the related question now to people like Nikhil would be like, does BBC have any such resources? Like, would you know, can you maybe ask your colleagues who maybe in some
The
of the
BBC
foundation
has
kind of work at BBC, but working with students, same thing what you said, right? We need to be having dialogues with our children, with our students about what's happening in the news, just to encourage dialogue that's maybe beyond at least what is happening what is being discussed in their households, right? Which is a bit more of I mean, that's a single perspective even within the household usually. But so just resources, I guess, like to just help
the
them
BBC. The
understand.
BBC has
Yeah.
abundant resources.
Mm.
Including something called the BBC Academy. I think I'm not the best person to be, sort of talking in detail about this, but I can certainly try and put Bhakti in touch with the people who, who closely look at these sorts of things. But yeah, I think I completely buy your point about there needing to be a sort of workshop, even for parents, on how to expose their children to politics, so that they have, kids have an informed take on things.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
And thanks for that, Ramya. We'll take you up on that, Nikhil. Do connect us, because we're always looking out for how do careers connect with children, and how can we make them more aware of the realities
By the
and
way, sorry, since I
bolo.
remembered, the BBC also has a news program for children, which is now on
Hmm.
a mainstream channel, by the way. So it used to be
Okay.
on PBs, which is the BBC Kids channel, but it's now come onto the main channel. It's called News Round. So they
Okay.
actually, for instance, I remember I was on a training in the UK with the presenter of News Round, who was going the following week to Ukraine to cover the Ukraine war for kids. So yeah, so I will try and put you in touch with the teams that
Yes.
do this stuff.
That would be immensely useful, because what we have in this room are a set of people that impact hundreds of kids, and they work with hundreds of students, and across a cross section of schools and cities and geographies. So it would be very useful to do that. We have the last we are actually at time, but if anyone else has any questions before I ask my big bang question to end this conversation, feel free to just unmute yourself and go ahead and ask that question. Namita, I see you on the screen. Hi.
Hi, just been listening.
Hi.
It's been great. Thank you so much, Nikhil.
Thank
A lot
you.
of my questions have been answered through the other folks, so thank you.
Okay, brilliant.
Awesome. Yeah, go ahead, Harish.
Nikhil, you gave a great example of how perhaps investment bankers could be great journalists of financial news. How about the other way around, where people having prepared to be journalists and have probably spent their first 3 or 5 years as a journalist or a news reporter, other than maybe being a communications leader for a company, are there other careers that they are best prepared for?
I think this is a fantastic question, and I'm so glad you asked it, because I feel, every year you have more and more journalists in the market without a job. And I think more of them need to be hired, because they bring a huge number of transferable skills that are relevant not just to communications jobs, but to, wide variety of fields. I mean, journalists are very hardworking. They are used to very quick deadlines. They work in large teams across different geographies. They are used to taking a lot of shit from all sides. They essentially are very resilient people, and I think all of these are skills that hold you in good stead for many difficult jobs. So I would totally sort of buy the argument that more journalists need to be hired in fields outside journalism.
Thanks for that, Nikhil, and thanks for that, Harish. And as we close, Nikhil, with the last 60 minutes of this conversation, it's been certainly an eye opener for me, and I'm not just saying this. When I entered this conversation, I had a slightly different view of where my potential career would be like, and what the reality is. Nikhil, I want to leave you with this question and would love to hear your response on this. What is the future of journalism? Um, what is it?
Wow. I mean, I'm not I'm not so prescient, Bhakti, but look, I would say that no matter what field you're in, it's going to be disrupted, right? Uh, it's the same thing that's happening with journalism, but I think at the core of it, journalism is about giving a voice to people. It's about holding those in power to account. It's about doing your job with the basic tenets of accuracy, fairness, impartiality, balance. It's about being accountable to the right people. So the right people are your readers and your viewers, and not your governments and the CEOs of companies, or the proprietors who fund you. And I think as long as all of these basic tenets are kept in place, journalism is going to continue to remain important. In what format, in what manner, and how it sort of transmutes into something else, whether TV is going to be dead, or whether digital will, whether YouTube will be more important, or whether Twitter finishes, etc. I mean, these are not things that one can predict, but the fact is that uh, you know there are people who are going to want information, who are going to want stories, and there are going to be journalists who are going to be delivering on that.
Well, wiser words have never been spoken. And thank you so much, Nikhil, for giving us your time. It's been one of the most satisfying sessions that I have ever hosted. I have a bias towards this field. So thank you for sharing everything so honestly. Thank you for sharing the resources. And we will definitely reach out to you to be in touch with some of them. Hopefully, we're able to make that contact. To everyone who joined, thank you so much for joining in. And I live my dream of being a journalist through doing panel discussions like these. I imagine myself on the TV screen in NDTV and hosting this. And I remember this is how I started my dream when I was like doing my journalism degree. But here I am now hosting an interview with Nikhil. Thank you so much, Nikhil. Thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight. And we will see you very, very soon.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It was
Thank
really.
you so much, Nikhil. It was super insightful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.